We got volunteers, staff people, board people. Hello, everybody. And my name, of course, is Genevieve. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the statewide housing organizer here. It is 6:35 now, so I want to jump into the presentation. We've got a lot to cover. And for those who are just filtering in, there will be stops for like questions throughout the whole thing. So those slides will look like this. And so whenever we get to one of these, we'll start, we'll do questions. Okay, so we're going to start with talking about the problem. We're talking about good cause eviction today, obviously, and we're going to start by talking about the problem that we see that has led to the creation of this law. And just a quick piece of history on it. This is not, as some of you may know, a new piece of legislation that's been introduced this year. The good cause eviction law has been on the state legislative floor since 2018. This is the fourth year of fighting for it. And initially it was part of a big package of tenant protection laws, and all of those were passed except good cause. And then of course, 2020, and that was in 2019. And then in 2020 and 2021, there were some other more urgent priorities. And now we are looking to 2022 as a year that we can pass this and finally secure the right to lease renewal for tenants. Okay, so to start, broad framing, there are three main reasons that you can get evicted in the state of New York. And when I say this, I'm talking about in eviction court. The first one of those is a non-payment eviction. That's when somebody is behind on rent. The second is a nuisance eviction. Colloquially, it's called that. It's when a tenant is like damaging a unit, harassing neighbors, violating the lease in some other substantial way. And then the third reason that people can get evicted in New York State eviction court is no reason at all. And that is called, we'll refer to it throughout this presentation as a no cause eviction, also as a non-renewal eviction or no cause non-renewal, because the way that this form of eviction works is it's when a landlord denies you a lease renewal without having a non-payment or lease violation argument. And of course, often this denial of a lease renewal, which forces us to move, is done to tenants who pay rent and comply with the lease, but just the landlord wants to discriminate against or retaliate against in some host of other ways. Just out of interest, is anybody who's on this call today ever had to leave an apartment because they were denied a lease renewal? Could I get like a hand raise function? We got a hand raised, 2, 3. Me, I actually, folks should know going into this call, I just got a notice of eviction proceedings yesterday because my landlord is initiating eviction proceedings against me for a no cause non-renewal of my lease. I'm up to date on rent. I haven't violated the lease at all, but I got notice yesterday, now that the moratorium is up, that they want to non-renewal evict me. So I have a big vested interest in passing this law. Okay, so yeah, we got some hands raised on the call of people who are here tonight who have been evicted through this exact process of a denial of a lease renewal. So before we get into it, I want to discuss together what are some reasons, and like people can suggest these in the chat or raise their hands. What are some reasons a landlord might evict someone who's paying the rent and complying with the lease? I see Ari has a hand raised. I see Diane has a hand raised. You want to answer that, Diane?
Oh, Carol. The jeans came in one day.
And when you're off mute. All right. Well, I'm not hearing from Diane, so I'll just read what's going on in the chat. Yeah, if everybody could please mute.
Oh.
Oh, Ari's raised her hand again. Diane, you have
Actually, yeah, well, this happened right at the beginning of the pandemic, literally the week that everything went into lockdown.
yeah.
We heard that the old owner of our small apartment building at the time, about 25 units, had sold it.
Mhm.
And the new landlord the new owner of the building said, guess what? We're not renewing anybody's leases.
Yeah. And
And
do you know
that was
why
it.
they did that?
They wanted to renovate the apartments and charge more rent. Interestingly enough, it's in a very hot area of Brooklyn. And I was very surprised that the new owner didn't want to renovate and sell the apartments, but apparently he wanted to keep them as rental units. But the rent went up. All but 2 or 3 of the apartments were market rate. And,
Yeah.
you know, per unit, I would say, from what I understand, the rent jumped between the leases that were in place
Mhm.
when the building was bought to after they were renovated, probably maybe $1,000, $1,500 per unit, depending on what the rate was under the old leases. But yeah, I mean, basically we were just said, hey, he just said, hey, we're not renewing anybody's leases in the building. Bye.
Yep, I see someone in the chat said gentrification, and that's really the process that you're describing, right? Is that a landlord
Yep.
wants to get rid of everyone who's in a house and replace them with newer, higher paying, often whiter demographic of tenants. Ari has the thing next, and I just want to remind folks that I'm not asked that we want to try to stay away from personal stories because that could take a long time to tell and focus on the reasons and motivations why a landlord might deny someone a lease renewal. Ari, do you want to go next and then we'll try to move on?
I was just going to say, if you have the audacity to ask for repairs or a habitable living space, they will try to evict you for people who will be more quiet.
And why is that?
Well, it's expensive to make repairs and have people have a habitable place to live.
Mm-hmm.
Also, sometimes they don't ask they don't like the way you ask.
Yeah.
Or if you have to go to the hospital.
Or they don't like you, as folks said as Damien said in the chat, discrimination is a reason that a landlord might deny someone who's paying rent and following the lease a renewal. So I'm gonna move on. I gave some answers here. But landlords evict tenants who challenge their power or their profit. And this is looking at this individualistically. So at Ari, as you said, asking for legally required repairs that cost money, that reduces profit. It can inconvenience the landlord. And importantly, it asserts your power as a tenant because it's asserting that you have a legal right that the landlord has to follow. And they like to feel superior. Often, like, home ownership and property investment is sold to people as a thing that makes them better than other people. And they should not have to be subservient to the whims of lowly tenants who are poorer than themselves. Criticizing the landlord, organizing with other tenants, that also challenges their power, and especially doing any of the above across, could we go on mute, guys? Doing any of the above across lines of racial, gender, and or class power. That makes the action way more offensive to the landlord because, again, it challenges their power and status as feeling superior to tenants. And zooming out and looking at systemic reasons, we addressed this too when folks talked about gentrification and white supremacy. Landlords will do, as someone mentioned, no-cause eviction sweeps of areas, often ones that contain lower income and often Black and brown tenants. And the goal is to replace that population with a wealthier and whiter tenant pool. This often happens around the same time as building sales, where a landlord will evict everybody as a result of or prior to a building being sold. Because part of what's being sold is control over who lives there. And that is a thing that increases the value of the home or of the building. Okay, so I'm going to talk about non-renewal of a lease as a form of what we're going to call for the purposes of presentation, informal eviction. And I'll show you why I call it that in a second. But non-renewal eviction can be done formally, quote unquote, through court, through the procurement of an eviction warrant, or it can be done informally outside of court. So a lot of times, and I imagine this is true for many people on this call, it's probably going to be true for me if my landlords pursue with the non-renewal eviction that I got notice yesterday that they're doing to me. Many tenants who are non-renewed leave before a court is ever brought into the conversation. We know that since the law doesn't protect us, we will just have to leave because we'll get a default judgment against us. We'll get an eviction on our records, even though we've done nothing wrong. Many of us just leave as soon as this lease non-renewal happens. For people who are on year-long leases, this an opportunity for this to happen comes up once a year, that a landlord can just evict you for no reason. But many people, especially in upstate New York, but also in New York City, are pushed into month-to-month lease agreements. And if you're in a month-to-month lease agreement right now under the law, unless you live in a place that's passed good cause locally, you can be non-renewal evicted at literally any time. And so here's some data on this. So the American Housing Survey is a study that is done by a collaboration of the Census Bureau and the Department for Housing and Urban Development on a bi-yearly basis. In 2017, prior to 2017, they only asked people about formal court-ordered evictions. And that was the thing they were tracking the rate of. In 2017, in their biannual survey, they started asking about informal eviction, forced moves that don't involve a court. And what they found, as you'll see here, is that once they started studying that, the scope of the eviction problem got massively larger. And they realized that there were all of these informal evictions happening. Breaking this down further, they found that over 70% of forced moves were these informal evictions that never see a day in court. And it dwarfs the number of building condemnations, moves due to missed rent payments, and even the amount of formal evictions that are obtained through court. So not only can tenants be evicted in court for no reason, way, way, way more tenants than ever end up in court are being forced out of our homes through these non-renewals that happen for no cause whatsoever, and there is no legal oversight of this process at all. And so I just want to make like a value statement here and state our position as an organization. It's not right that tenants can be evicted for no reason. Allowing this permits widespread discrimination and retaliation. Something I'm going to ask of folks a couple times on this call is to get off mic and say something together with me. If you don't want to, you don't have to, but I'm going to ask of folks who are willing to get off of the mic and we'll repeat this together. Can folks get off mute, and I'll count down from 3, 3, 2, 1. It's not right
that tenants
can be evicted
for no
reason. Allowing this permits widespread discrimination and retaliation.
Thank you for that, everybody. All right, we're back on mute. Well, we're going to go on to good cause as a solution to this problem. But before we do, I just want to know if anybody has any questions about the scope and state of this problem. And we're going to go into a little bit later some more specific statistics about like inequality and how that interacts with this problem. But does anyone have questions on what we've talked about so far?
Can you show that slide one more time just for a second?
This one? Yeah, if folks want to write this down, that is also a very powerful thing to do. There will be a couple other slides like this later in the presentation. The slides will be available. I don't know that I can say online, but I can definitely get them emailed to the folks that participate on this call.
Genevieve, I don't have a question, but I do have a statement, if that's okay.
Okay.
So I work with Citizen Action in New York City. Shout out to Simone, and I saw Vanessa on here as well. One of the things that is really key about this in my mind is that it's literally in the name, right? We're literally saying that you have to have a good cause to evict someone. And it really is honestly that straightforward, right? We have the reasons to, validate that and to make our argument, but it at its core and essence, that's literally what we're trying to say. And so
Yeah.
I love the way that you're putting this together and talking about this issue to drive home those points. But I just want to reiterate that that's something to really remember as we go through this. And it's so important to fight for something that sounds so basic, because it is. That's all.
Totally agreed. And you are going to love this slide. So going into the solution here, good cause will end no cause non-renewals. It bans them outright. Good cause eviction, the way this law fundamentally works, is it requires landlords to prove a good cause before non-renewing a tenant, just like they have to with other forms of eviction. So like I said, 72% of evictions don't even ever see a court date. And many of these are due to no cause non-renewals. And this law, if passed, will bring all of those under the purview of the court, which, to be clear, is not like, it's not the front lines of the revolution, but it is a place that if we have legal protections, we can assert them in a controlled and predictable way. This will also allow tenants to request repairs and assert other rights without fear of retaliation, and be ourselves without fear of discriminatory eviction.
I think it's
Okay.
important to notice because it is on the front lines. Everybody needs to be able to live indoors, and that you can't really get anything else done if otherwise.
Oh, of
Plus-
course, housing is absolutely on the front lines of our needs
Yeah.
as people. I meant that the court and the law are not the front lines of a revolutionary restructuring of society, but they are a tool that we can use to achieve our goals. And that's why we work on legislation in addition to working on things outside of that legal system. Okay, so I'm going to go into how the law works. Some of this is going to be specific language straight from the bill, which I know is a little bit off in the weeds, but since you guys showed up to a lobbying training, I'm assuming that you're ready to read a little bit of legal language. So the way that this bill functionally works is that it says no landlord shall, by action to evict or recover possession, blah, 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 by failure to renew a lease or otherwise remove a tenant from housing accommodations, except for good cause as defined in this section. So it groups non-renewal and eviction together and says you need the same proof of cause for both of those actions. And then it goes on to list what those are. And we're going to go on to that list. Does this make sense to folks so far? Okay. So we're going to go into what the law's good causes are. And I actually just want to highlight something Simone just said in the comment. If you're a good landlord, you're not evicting tenants for no reason in the first place. This is us protecting tenants from predatory landlords. And we'll dive a little bit more into this argument when we get to the lobbying part, but really want to emphasize that if a landlord can't come up with one of these reasons, there is definitely no good reason for why they should be evicting somebody. I mean, I would argue some of these aren't even good reasons, but that's my opinion. But anyway, I want to note that in the Senate hearing that was recently held on this bill, several senators asked panels of landlords, what reason would you want to evict someone besides that they're not paying rent or that they're violating the lease? And they were really interesting moments because it was total silence from the landlords in the room when they were asked that question. They can't come up with an answer because the real reason is that they want to retain the power to discriminate and retaliate against people who challenge their power, but they don't want to say that in front of senators. So anyway, we're going into the good causes. And just for my own facilitation reasons, Ari and the person with the name Lyric Thompson, could you put your hands down just so it takes the little hands notification off of my screen? Thank you guys. Okay, so the first and main reason is non-payment of rent. Unless a rent increase is unreasonable, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. It's kind of a little off in the weeds, but basically this law does not stop most non-payment evictions from happening. I really want to call out as we talk about this, that from a worldview and values standpoint, being too poor is not a good reason to make somebody homeless. And the fact that it's considered a good cause under this law does not mean the same thing as us endorsing that poverty is a good reason to put somebody on the street. And I just want to be like really clear about that whatever the legal language is here, that is not an idea that we're endorsing at all. Law is just specifically about non-renewals. And so it has these carve outs so that it can be about that thing. Preventing people from being evicted for being too poor would be more of a challenge to the Constitution, which we should do. It's just a different fight. The next reason is violating the lease. As long as the landlord has sent the tenant like a notice to cure the violation. So saying, hey, you're violating this part of the lease, you need to fix this within, I believe it's 10 days, which right now they're not required to do that if you're in an unregulated, unstabilized apartment. The next reason is damaging the unit or harassing neighbors. The next reason is that the unit has been condemned, that the city has declared it unsafe city or town has declared it unsafe for human occupancy, use of the unit for an illegal purpose, refusing landlord access for repairs or showings, or finally, a landlord, and this is my least favorite carve out, a landlord wants to occupy a small building for personal or family use, with some exceptions for tenants who are disabled or elderly. This is a clause that's really, really important to the landlords who have like vacation homes that they want to like move in to retire or something. I don't totally understand it, but it is a relatively small number of housing units and is for some reason the most important thing to landlords who are coming to the legislative table on this. So it's in the bill and has been since 2019. But yeah, these are the reasons that are considered good causes for eviction under the law. And anything outside of these, you cannot be evicted for. And your landlord must prove that you've broken one of these clauses in order to be able to evict you if this bill passes. So next, diving into the rent increase thing just a little bit. This is kind of off in the weeds, and it really shouldn't be the primary point of discussion with legislators, but I just talking to you guys about how to lobby this bill, you should know that this is the number one thing that real estate is going to bring up, and that the legislators who are in the pockets of real estate in one way or another are going to bring up as the reason that they're upset about this bill. They're going to call it universal rent control, which it absolutely is not, as much as we would love if it were universal rent control. It's not. That also is another bill for another day, hopefully one that this bill will give us the right and security to organize for as tenants. But the way that good cause and rent increases interact with each other is that good cause allows tenants to defend ourselves from an eviction case if our rent has been quote unquote unreasonably raised. So that means in the context of this bill, it defines unreasonable as 1.5 times the general inflation of the housing market, plus whatever costs the landlord can prove that have been incurred, like if they've had to undergo a major renovation or something like that. If inflation is low or negative, it still considers raises up to 3% to be reasonable. So, and importantly, since this is an eviction law, it doesn't actually stop the landlords from making these rent increases. It also doesn't prevent them from bringing financial lawsuits against people who don't pay these increases. What it does, and I want folks to really pay attention to this part because it's going to be important. What this law does with regards to rent increases is that if your landlord unreasonably and exorbitantly raises your rent, this prevents them from using eviction and police violence against you as a punishment for that, for being unable to afford that. They can still pursue financial judgments, but they cannot send the police to your home to throw you on the street, which, like, as we talk about this bill, we have to be honest about the fact that this is not addressing and not ultimately solving the financial inequality that exists between tenants and landlords. It's not solving the issue of unaffordable rents that people can't pay. But what it does do is prevent the police from coming to the homes of people who have suffered unreasonable rent increases and throwing them on the street, which is an improvement. And most of the bill is about the non-renewal stuff, not about the rent increases. This more exists to prevent it from being a loophole that any landlord can just raise your rent unreasonably and then evict you for that. This prevents that behavior from being like incentivized by the rest of the bill. So who will good cause help? Well, this is a list of all of the, I don't know if it's all the counties in New York, but it's a list of list that's ordered by how many people in a given county are going to be covered by good cause. You'll see my county, Tompkins, is right up at the top as far as how many of us will be covered under good cause. Good cause covers renters who are in unstabilized private housing units. So if you are in public housing, good news, you already have these protections. If you are in a rent stabilized apartment or a rent controlled apartment, you have similar protections to these. This is for everyone who's living in unregulated housing units. And so obviously New York is going to have lower percentage of eligibility than the rest of the state because New York has rent stabilization programs that give similar protections to these. But across New York State, it is about 16 or 1.6 million households. So around 2.5 times that many people who will be protected by good cause.
How? Okay.
Could folks go on mute? Okay, and a specific point, it's going a little bit more broad, but it is really important to discuss in the context of who does good cause eviction protect. Yeah, I love a passionate baby. I thought it was shouting how, and I was like, well, we're talking about how. But yeah, so I want to talk about the intersection of rental housing and systemic racism and how good cause eviction, in addition to being a blanket discrimination protection, specifically is necessitated by the level of systemic racism and discrimination in the housing market, not just in the lease renewal process, but this first part, when it comes to housing access, because once you're displaced from an apartment, you don't have to find a new place to live because living on the street sucks. It is terrible for so many reasons. I have been there. It is not fun. So when you find a new apartment, people of color have all sorts of systemic gates to finding new apartments. And it's not just the individual racism of landlords or brokers who are showing apartments to people, or previous landlords who develop discriminatory vendettas against tenants and will then give a bad reference to that tenant. But it's also economic discrimination in the form of credit checks, income requirements. Landlords will only rent you an apartment if the rent is less than 30% of your income, trying to manage your budget for you. But what they're really saying is, I don't want to rent to poor people. And of course, people of color and other marginalized groups are disproportionately poor. And so as a result, that is a racist housing practice. And something to note as I talk about this slide is that there's a lot of statistics on here, and they don't really describe the breadth and complexity of the intersection of race and ethnicity, because these are statistics from the United States government, which does not do a great job of separating these things out. So I wish there were better data on this, but I just want folks to know that, like, it talks about the median net worth of Black and Hispanic households. Of course, Hispanic folks can be white or Black. This is just how the US government collects this data. So Black households are twice as likely as white households to have no savings to fall back on, which makes it dramatically more difficult to find a new place to live because you need to put first month and security down at the same time. That often costs thousands of dollars. White households are twice as likely as Black households to have over $10,000 in savings in their savings account. So white people have a lot easier time. And this describes me as a white woman. I'm currently being non-renewal evicted, and I have the ability to to start looking for apartments and find a new place to live. But if I were a woman of color, especially as a trans woman, I would be much less likely for all sorts of systemic reasons to have that ability. And so that can create a waterfall effect of other crises. When it comes to wealth and like whether or not somebody's renting a house, this is a statistic that surprises a lot of people, I think, who haven't looked into this. The median net worth for Black and Hispanic households is $24,000 and $36,000. The median net worth of a white household is almost $200,000. That is, in a lot of cases, the difference between putting a huge down payment down on a house or accumulating other forms of wealth that give you more stability. White house, and this goes into like intergenerational wealth and so on. White people are far better set up to be homeowners, to move apartments, etc., than Black and brown people are. And so as a result, being displaced, whether it's officially through court with an eviction order or informally via a non-renewal, is a much more impactful thing for Black and brown folks than it is for white people. And when it comes to owning versus renting, most of New York's housing is owner occupied. We have like a 55–60% owner occupancy rate, so like home owning, but around 70% of Black New Yorkers rent housing. And this goes into this historic, like intergenerational dispossession of wealth. It means that Black and brown people have less access to home ownership. Black New Yorkers make up 15% of the state's population, but 22% of its renters, which is, you know, an over 50% over representation of the rental class. And so this is really important to understand in like understanding why protections of this kind are not just for the single incident of discrimination that leads somebody to be displaced, but also has to do with how that ripples into the rest of somebody's life and how, you know, access to a new place to live is differently distributed among the white population and especially the Black population, given the historic dispossession of land and thereby housing that Black people have dealt with at the hands of white folks in the United States. Okay, so summary, and then we're gonna move on to lobbying. Good cause eviction here's what it does and doesn't do. It secures the rights for us to organize and assert our rights without fear of eviction. It prevents, so that's like asking for repairs, refusing landlords if they want to just come into our apartment at all hours of whenever just to harass us. We should be able to refuse that without having to worry about being evicted. It prevents discriminatory and retaliatory eviction by banning no-cause non-renewals. And it acknowledges non-renewal as a form of eviction and holds it to the same legal standard as other forms of eviction. What it does not do is stop most non-payment evictions. Like I said, we talking about this have to understand and be real about that and recognize that there are other necessary fights to have. It does not proactively prevent landlords from raising the rent. It gives people who are facing eviction a way to avoid punitive homelessness and police violence if their rent has been raised unreasonably. Okay, that was a lot of information. Before we move on to the next part, I want to make a space for questions, comments, etc. And time check, we've got another about 25 minutes. I expect the lobbying part to take about that long. In that, there will be a little 10-minute discussion.
Slide again.
Hmm?
Can I look at the previous slide again?
This one? Yes, absolutely. And like I said, I will make sure that this gets, you know, emailed to the list of folks who attended tonight. Does while that note taking is happening, does anybody else have any questions or comments on the information that's been presented here?
I do.
Yeah.
I have a situation where I've never met the landlord who owns the property that I'm in.
Mm-hmm.
And last year I took it upon myself to reach out to any organization that will help me because we had a lot of issues in this apartment and we still do. Mm-hmm. And one thing led to another. The property management that was overseeing it, they quit because the city came down on them about the violations. So now there's a new property management, and they served me with papers today, a written letter. And I know it's illegal. They're saying like I have to get out, but like you can't just come and write a notice, there has to be a court date and all of that nature.
Yeah.
But they're trying to collect rent from when the last property management owned it. Can they do that?
I am not sure. I think that especially with the financial stuff, it is a question for legal help for like
Okay.
for like a legal help institution. Do you live in New York City?
I live in Monroe County.
Oh, Monroe County.
Yes.
Okay. Do you know Barb Rivera?
No, I don't, sweetie.
Barb Rivera is a citizen action organizer who is on this call and organizes in Monroe County. At least I think she's
Okay.
on this call. Barb, are you still here? Hi. Okay. Barb is in the chat. You guys can exchange numbers over DM, and Barb, I'm
Okay.
assuming that you can help connect to some sort of legal assistance in the region that can help answer that question.
Thank you.
But just to say, like you said, that you just got a notice that you've got to leave in a certain number of days and there's no court order. That's exactly what I got yesterday too. And I can assure you that that does not mean you have to leave immediately. What it means
Right.
basically is that they are saying, we might take you to court if you don't leave in this number of days. And even if you do get taken to court, like there is a eviction through the court is a process that takes some time. Courts are especially backed up right now because of the moratorium ending. So
Right.
definitely don't leave your house immediately. And you and Barb should connect in the chat DMs here. And Shayna's pasting a link to the Law New York free legal aid services who have a Rochester office.
Okay, yeah, because I know a little bit about housing laws, and I know there's a lot of laws that's going into effect. And I know a lot of times they try to use scare tactics,
Exactly.
especially when they think that you don't know. My thing is, I'm a mother, I have 3 children. I've tried to work with these, not only the previous property management, but this one too. And it's like they're at a standstill. And
Yeah.
you guys know that you were cited for these violations. You haven't even called to even have them to come in to see what repairs you did, but you're steady harassing me about rent.
And Barb has pasted her number in the chat. If you look through the
Okay.
chat, you'll have it DM to you. But because of those violations to the code laws, you may even have defenses against any sort of eviction that come as a result of that. So definitely get connected and talk about options.
All right.
I'm
Well,
sorry
thank you so much.
Can I ask a question, Genevieve? I'm sorry.
Yes, but I do want to move to the next part. But yeah, if we can make it quick.
Okay, I was just gonna ask her. Sorry, my name is Mercedes, and I live in Monroe County as well. I was just curious what building that you live in.
I live in an apartment, a house. It was like a whole house, but they cut it up, so it's 2 apartments. And it's a month-to-month lease.
Okay, all right, thank you.
You're welcome, sweetie. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Justine. I'm sorry that you're dealing with that. And of course, solidarity from somebody who got a similar notice at her door the other day.
Well, you guys really took a lot of pressure off of me because I was in here going back crazy, like, and I thank you guys.
Yeah, you're definitely not alone.
Thank you.
All right, so we are going to move on to talking about lobbying now. Just to start, we have a couple dates that are important here. February 16th is our org-wide lobby day. This is going to be a virtual event this year because we are still in a pandemic after this long. But on February 16th, there's going to be an all-day lobbying event. This is going to be, you can meet with legislators, talk to them about the bill. This is a fantastic way to get familiar with what that like pressing against elected officials process looks like, get some practice, and actually like make a difference in the process, because they're so used to hearing from like professionals and like political operatives and, you know, all of the folks in our position who work on this stuff all day. And it means a hell of a lot more to them when they hear about the importance of something from somebody who's, you know, not being paid to tell them a certain thing, but just either deals with it personally or really believes in it. And so you can sign up for that, and I'll have this link again at the end. If you go to cit.ac/2022 lobby, you can register for that lobby day. And Simone is pasting the link for that in the chat. And then a month later, because sitting and asking them nicely is not the path to actually getting change all by itself, we are going to a day of action on March 15th, which is where we gather in Albany in person to demand the passage of the bills that are on our justice agenda. So we ask them nicely in February. Most of the time they don't do it all right away. And so then we hit them with a little bit of escalation in March. Yeah, and there's a URL down at the bottom here. It's cit.ac/2022 action. I'm assuming somebody will paste that in the chat. And that is where you can register for that day of action in March. It'll be a good time. And these links will be available again at the end. Okay, so lobbying. When we sit and lobby a legislator, we start with, we have a way that we talk about our issues at Citizen Action. And this is designed to, like, it's based off the fundamental idea that things become more powerful the more you repeat them, and they become more familiar and they become more real the more often that they're repeated. And so what we hear a lot of from the conservative side of the aisle and from even corporate Democrats and from the real estate lobbies and so on is ideas and framings and values like individualism and like the importance of preserving profit and the free market and so on. And, you know, we hear these all the time, and legislators hear these all the time, and it strengthens those values in their head. It makes them a lot more real. And so the way that we counter that is not by having the conversation on their terms and continuing to repeat those ideas and values just in the form of refuting them, but is to instead state our own values and put those in their heads and repeat those over and over and over again until they become bigger and more powerful than the narratives and values that are being presented to them by our opposition. So some ideas for value statements that align with good cause is that we envision a world that recognizes the inherent dignity of every person and guarantees a safe, stable housing as a human right, or it's time to stop predatory landlords and protect renters, or every person should have a safe and stable place to live, or we all deserve safe and stable housing, and then that's why we want to pass good cause, etc. Another really helpful tactic to pair along with leading with those value statements that we always want to start our statements and our conversations with is framing a conflict with those values, showing how the world that's in front of us right now is in conflict with these very reasonable values that almost anybody can agree with, that even legislators who oppose us can probably agree with, but show how the world we're living in right now is in conflict with that by telling them that while we, you know, deserve these things, while the world needs to be this way, right now, people don't report necessary repairs because we're afraid we'll lose our homes. Marginalized people live in fear of discriminatory non-renewals. Tenants can be evicted for no reason, which is just so wrong. And without safe and stable housing, people can't truly be free. And that evictions, unfair rent hikes, and unsafe living conditions disproportionately affect Black and Brown people. And then move from there too, and that's why we need to pass good cause, ensure tenants no longer evicted in retaliation for opposing unsafe and inhumane living conditions or displaced to gentrify neighborhoods. So I'm gonna ask people to come off mic. I know it's kind of messy on Zoom. If you don't wanna come off mic, grab a notepad and write this down, but we're gonna do another phrase repetition. And I'm gonna count down from 3, 2, 1. every person
Every person
right
has a
to
right to
stable
safe,
housing.
stable housing.
Because without
Without it,
cannot
they
truly
cannot
be
be
free.
free.
Good cause gives
Good
tenants
cause
that
gives
freedom.
tenants that freedom.
So what we just did together was we led with a value, and then we framed a conflict, and then we proposed a solution to that conflict. The value is the right to safe and stable housing. The conflict is that without that, we aren't truly free to be ourselves, to send our kids to the schools that they want to go to have a place to go home after work, to choose the job that we want rather than the second job that we need in order to pay unaffordable rents, etc. We're going to do another one. I'm going to count down from 3, 2, 1. We need to
We
protect
need to protect these tenants
past good
and pass good cause because it's
wrong that
wrong
people can be
for
evicted
no
for no
reason.